Welcome back from lunch. How was your lunch? Was okay? Mediocre response there. I thought mine was pretty good. The hard part now is that we've really made it hard for Michael to present now because we feed everybody and we're all ready for our afternoon nap. And so, Michael, I'm sorry. However, here's what I believe. I believe that you will stay awake. And I'm just really deeply honored and appreciative that we have Reverend Piazza with us today. I feel like I don't need to introduce him because Daryl has been doing such a great job of cheerleading, and I think rightly so. Would you please welcome Michael Piazza?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Bob. And thank you all for being here. And so now the task is mine to see if I can keep you awake for the next hour. So we'll see about that. You know, I saw in the brochure I was listed as not as a pastor, which I've done for 50 years, or as a seminary professor, which I did for 15 or 16 years, or as an author, because I have 13 books, or as a consultant, which I do as well. I'm listed as an activist, which means that all of the people before me have been very nice, and my job is to not be. So if in the next hour I don't make you feel uncomfortable a time or two, then I will have failed. So that's sort of one of my objectives. I really, in all seriousness, am really honored to be with you today, and I will say that I have been more touched by this experience than I anticipated being. I'm able to sort of segregate my emotions and usually leave them at the front door of the church. And this has not been the case this weekend. And I woke up this morning and I was like, what on earth in San Antonio am I allergic to? And I kept wiping my eyes and my nose all morning long, and I thought, okay, I have it under control. I'll be all right about 1 o'clock. And then Mark started, and I started all over again. So if I just start weeping and sniffling in the middle of this, it's Mark's fault. So, you know, I imagine that this time that we have spent together has been more joyful than this gathering probably was in the previous two incarnations as a result of the recent General Conference. I was invited to come and speak prior to the decision of the General Conference. I have to confess that as a former United Methodist, I didn't even know the General Conference was happening. And so not only was I surprised by the decision, I was surprised that it was even happening. And then it made me think, no, okay, so I'm supposed to talk about inclusion. That's a very different talk to give now than it might have been prior to General Conference. So I've been sort of rethinking what it is that I have to say on this subject. I'm writing another book. Actually, I'm writing two right now, but one of them is entitled, the working title is, Stories They Never Told You in Sunday School. And what I'm trying to do is uncover some of the stories in the Bible that might not have been interpreted the same way for people of color, or for women, or for LGBTQI people. And I start the book like the Bible starts with Genesis 1:1, and we look at that sort of description of God there in Genesis 1:1. And my observation about it is that Genesis reveals God right from the very start as being the divine, non-binary creator of us all. You remember it says, let us create humans in our image, male and female. God created them. The image of God being both masculine and feminine. And it's always been important to me to remind my congregations that that's not only true about God, but it's true about us all. God didn't create us male and female, but that God created me male and female, and you male and female, female and male. We are a mixture of both of those things inside of us, and that is part of what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God. So today, mostly, I would like to tell you a story as a way of inviting you to reclaim the divine story. I want to invite you to hear the story in a new and liberating way. I think that is critical because you are among those who will determine the future of the United Methodist Church, the new United Methodist Church, in the wake of this most recent General Conference. Now, let me say that I understand completely the anxiety that has been created by the schism that has been most recently in the news. And I want to remind you, as others have before me, that this is not the first schism of the United Methodist Church. And I think, again, this is my first rude remark perhaps, I think that it isn't an accident that former slave-owning states, conferences in former slave-owning states, are among the greatest percentage and number. I understand about 40% of churches have disaffiliated in former slave-owning Texas. There are some parallels that should be drawn there, but the only one I want to draw this afternoon is they were on the wrong side of history then, and they are on the wrong side of history now. I deeply, deeply appreciate the fact that the United Methodist Church has worked very hard to allow these churches to go without rancor or criticism. But it is imperative for us to remember, especially in the challenging days ahead, that we are on the right side of history because God has never been in favor of discrimination. Now, being right doesn't always pay. And if you think it does, you're one of the ones who skipped the Good Friday service this year. I mean, Jesus taught us to turn the other cheek, but that wasn't a strategy for not getting hit. And Jesus taught us to go the second mile, but that isn't a recipe for living a restful life. Being right doesn't always pay. Jesus tried to teach people the way of grace, unconditional love. But remember where that got him: crucified. There is a cost. Otherwise, Jesus wouldn't have said over and over and over, "Take up your cross and follow me." Still, despite the fact that we may feel right now like we are bearing a cross in the United Methodist Church, I would remind you what my friend Anthony Campolo likes to say: it's Friday, but Sunday's a-coming. Good Friday wasn't the end of the story of Jesus, and this disaffiliation isn't the end of the story of the United Methodist Church. I write a daily devotion, have for years. It goes out to about 20,000 people, called Liberating Word. This past week, or week before last, after the vote at the General Conference, I put on my church growth consultant hat, or my church growth professor hat, and I predicted that the Methodist churches which have left the denomination over the issue of inclusion will flourish. You watch. Those churches will experience growth and excitement, and they will flourish. However, they will flourish for only a time. Because you see, those who are drawn to them, who are drawn to the decision to discriminate, are old. Now, I say that because I'm old. And so I think I have the right to say that, yes, they may agree with that decision now, but their children and grandchildren won't be attracted to a church that discriminates. They will not be attracted to a church that believes in a God who created people a certain way and then said, "Off with you, I want no part." The acceptance and support of young people for LGBTQ equality is good news. Now, I should say that good news doesn't necessarily translate to the church. The church isn't always able to handle good news. You see, we have allowed the conservatives and the excluding churches to define for the public what Christianity means. This is particularly true in the minds of young people. This is my second rude thing, or maybe third. I think progressive and inclusive churches have been too dang polite, proper, reserved. We've sat quietly, non-critically, while we've let others define the story. Even now, the congregations leaving the United Methodist Church are getting almost all the publicity, or at least they were up until General Conference. You know, if God had put me in charge of the Methodist, I would have said to the United Methodist around me, as soon as this vote is over, we are going to spend several $1 million on a campaign that says to the entire world, if you are looking for a church that will welcome you, that will welcome your children, that will welcome your friends, if you are looking for a church that will welcome you, all you've got to do is look for the cross and the flame. That's where you'll find it. And yet, who knows that now? I should say that I grew up in the United Methodist Church. I attended a United Methodist seminary. At least my first seminary degree was from Candler School of Theology. And I worked my way all the way through college and seminary as a student pastor in United Methodist churches in the South Georgia Conference. When I was ordained in that conference, I knelt beside a man named Big Jim Moore. Now, Big Jim Moore was older than the rest of us, much older. He was probably in his mid to late 60s. But the reason he was so late getting ordained was that he had spent the previous 40 years in the federal penitentiary, where he had been convicted of murder. That day, they ordained a convicted murderer, Moore, Big Jim Moore, kneeling beside Michael Piazza. They did it in alphabetical order. If they had known the truth about me, they never would have ordained me. But I was still closeted and frankly celibate and hadn't been fully out to even myself. But they ordained, rightly so, Big Jim Moore, a convicted murderer, but would have not have ordained me. Now, at that time, the bishop came down the line and laid his hands on me, and my bishop was William Ragsdale Cannon, the nelliest man I have ever met, at least up until that time, unmarried. And I observed Bishop Cannon and thought, you know, if he can do it, so can I. And I decided that I would just live a celibate, closeted life and get by within the United Methodist Church. And for a time, that worked very well. Eventually, though, I decided that you can't preach the truth and live a lie. So, in preparation for coming out, I moved back to Atlanta, where I had gone to seminary and served an urban church there, not too far from Emory. That was all well and good until one day I really messed up. I met the sweetest man that I've ever met in the whole world to this day. His name was Bill, and I fell in love. And suddenly, I was no longer gay in theory, but I was gay in reality. Despite the fact that churches which I had pastored in South Georgia had been named Church of the Year by the conference, despite the fact that they had all grown sometimes miraculously, the fact that I loved another man was all it took to end my time in the United Methodist Church. Now, fortunately, for the first and maybe the only time in my life, I was prepared. I knew this was coming. And so I had consciously, deliberately done things to prepare myself for the day this came, when I knew I would lose my career, my future dreams, my friends, and probably my family. I was fired by the Methodist Church, and the very next week went right up the street, just a few blocks away actually, and became a pastor in the Metropolitan Community Church, which was thriving back then, not much anymore, but it was a mostly LGBTQI denomination. Bill and I got married in that church in 1980. In 1980 in Georgia. 2 city council people attended our wedding. One of them, you know their name, because that he became later a congressman, Congressman John Lewis. He was elected as a city council person on Tuesday, and he attended a gay wedding on Friday. He's a true hero in my life, and I think in all of our lives. Bill and I got married legally on our 35th anniversary in that same neighborhood in Atlanta, not that same church. It's gone now. We got married in November on our anniversary, and the next month in December, Bill was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. He died 7 months later on my birthday. It was and is the greatest loss of my life, but I will say that if I had to choose between Bill and the Methodist Church, I'd make the same choice. In 1987, going back a little bit in history, Bill and I left Jacksonville, Florida, where we pastored a church there, and moved to Dallas, Texas, where I became the pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church of Dallas. That church had about 180 members when I arrived there, and they were in the midst of the worst of the AIDS crisis. Now, I preached for the very first time there on the first Sunday of November, All Saints Sunday, in 1987. In January of 1988, just a couple of months later, in this 180-member church, we did 18 funerals, 4 in one day. All of those for whom we did funerals that January were under the age of 35, just about the age I was then. Still, despite the fact that we did, while I was there, over 1,500 funerals, that church grew. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew. We changed our name to the Cathedral of Hope, and its growth continued until we had over 4,500 members. We had 2,500 people who worshiped with us every Sunday in person, and another 65,000 who worshiped online and on TV. It was the most amazing journey. And I will say that during that time of spectacular growth, I had no clue what was going on. I felt like I was running along behind a runaway train and just hanging on to the caboose for all my life. It was there, in that church, though, that I discovered that being an inclusive church is much tougher than it sounds. We tried to welcome everyone, and that sounds like a wonderful thing that all churches should do. But I had to doubt occasionally whether that was wise or not. Like when the first time, and it was just the first time, the KKK decided to come and worship with us. The police called and warned me they were coming, and they said, now, church is private property, and so you don't have to let them in if you don't want to. Well, that was quite a quandary, because we said all means all. So we did, in fact, have to welcome them in. But I have to say that by that time, that church was so packed on Sunday mornings, we had to save them seats so they could worship with us. Over the years that I was there, we were often picketed. We had bomb threats on a regular basis. There were occasions when those threats were significant enough that though the congregation never knew it, I wore a bulletproof vest under my vestments. My daughters, Bill and I had 2. My daughters do not have my last name because it would have endangered them. The police drove by my house every few hours, every single night, because they explained to me that I was on their list of the most endangered species in Dallas. Being in favor of inclusion isn't always safe or easy. Not everybody appreciates those values. And this afternoon, I want to ask you and challenge you. Do you? Do you really? Oh, I know we are here today because our churches welcome people of color and LGBTQ people. But I want to say, as someone who pastored the world's largest predominantly LGBTQ congregation for 22 years, even that church struggled to really mean it when they said, all are welcome. Once upon a time, my mentors in the church growth movement used to teach that homogeneity was a church growth principle. Now, clearly, that is a value that I reject. But I must also acknowledge that diversity and inclusion makes any growth and vitality much, much slower. After I'd been in Dallas for over 2 decades, in 2011, my denomination, the United Church of Christ, asked me if I'd be willing to become a consultant, teaching other churches how to be revitalized and grow. And I said I would, but I wasn't sure that I knew anything about growing a church. Oh, yeah, I was the pastor of a mega church, but it felt like it happened to me, not that I did anything. So I had to spend the next few months figuring out what it was I did know. And I wasn't sure that it still applied. So in order to not be a fraud, I took a tiny church in Atlanta, Georgia, and a church that was so small, in fact, that they couldn't even afford a pastor. And I was the nearest free pastor they could find. And I became the pastor of the Virginia Highland Church in Atlanta. Now, ironically, it is in the same exact neighborhood, just blocks from the Methodist church that had kicked me out. And a few blocks in the other direction is the Metropolitan Community Church that married me and Bill. It was like coming home for us in lots of ways. Unfortunately, that church had declined to the point that it only had maybe 20 people on Sundays. I used to jokingly say, though there's a good bit of truth in this, that church had 6 little old ladies and 16 gay men who took care of them. And that was the definition of the Virginia Highland Church when I arrived. So the deal was, they wouldn't pay me anything, but they would let me experiment on them to see if I knew or could figure out how to grow a progressive, inclusive church today. Now, the first couple of years that I was there, I thought they got the better end of this deal because that church didn't grow at all, no matter what I tried or no matter what I did. Part of the problem was they had decided they wanted to be a diverse and inclusive church and had no idea what that would take. So we labored along, and after the first year or two, Bill and I kind of looked at one another and said, maybe we've lost our touch. Then on my 3rd Easter at that church, I stood out front on the portico that you can see there out in front of those red doors and welcomed people, as I do every Sunday. And I was standing there, and people started coming to church for Easter, and they kept coming, and they kept coming, and they kept coming. After a while, I got a little panicky. I ran back inside, and I said to the ushers, go up in the balcony and dust things off because we're going to have to use it. And sure enough, for the first time in 50 years, we filled the balcony of that church. It was the most amazing thing. It was literally the answer to my prayer. This church was diverse. It was 60% straight, 40% LGBTQ. It was 30% people of color, and it just went on and on. And it had a huge ministry to the homeless. It was an answer to my prayer because every Sunday morning, as a white Southern Methodist minister, because in my bones that's still who I am, I went to that church to preach, but I took the long way round and drove by the grave of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I always hoped to catch a red light there so I could whisper a prayer that God would give me one last gift. I had pastored a mega church. Now I wanted to pastor a genuinely multiracial church. I grew up in the segregated South in South Georgia, and I wanted to do penance of that, and I wanted to be a part of the church that church that embodied the beloved community. Sometimes you should be careful what you pray for. Although I taught church growth at Hartford Seminary for 10 years, 15, mostly 15, almost 15, I'll confess that growing an inclusive church isn't for sissies, and I have the scars to prove it. So let me give you some examples of how and why it was and is so difficult. When I arrived in Dallas, one of the first things I had to do was fire the music director. He had been a Southern Baptist music director, and so he insisted on singing patriotic songs on the Sunday closest to the 4th of July. He insisted on giving flowers out to the mothers in the congregation on Mother's Day, despite the fact that in this congregation, most of the women were not mothers. And many of the people, remember this is the late 80s, many of the people in that congregation had been wounded by their mothers. He refused to use inclusive language with the hymns. He tried to explain to me that he couldn't change the words of the hymn because it wouldn't honor the author's intent. I tried to explain to him that we changed the words of the Bible. So that carried no weight with me. This, remember, was the late 80s, and gay men accused me of catering to the lesbians because I changed the words of their favorite hymns. Now, they didn't know the scripture well enough to know I had changed those words too, or they'd have complained about it. I tried to explain to them that if we were an all-male congregation, it would still be important that we use inclusive language that embraced the feminine divine. Because these gay men had been penalized, punished many times because of their femininity. Because that God was a male, so naturally being the male was the best and right thing to do. But gay men knew better than that. And so by accepting their feminine side, they needed to understand their call to be the most ardent feminist. Homophobia, then and now, is just one more expression of sexism. My friend Mary Daly says, when God is male, then the male is God. And as long as we only refer to God as him and he, then male is going to continue to be God, which excludes my daughters would never go to a Methodist church or a United Church of Christ that didn't honor the feminine divine. Future of this church will be decided in part by how well we do that. And it isn't just about the honoring the feminine divine, but it is about honoring the feminine in each and all of us as being divine. Eventually, the Baptist minister of music went on his way, and I won this battle for inclusive language until Christmas. I have to say, I've been doing this 50 years, and I never get beaten up more than I do when I change the words of Christmas carols. And that is the same today as it has been for the half a century. Sheesh. Being inclusive is tough work, and it isn't just about gender. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone sitting in a wheelchair when the song director says, "Stand with me"? Or looked in the eyes of a person of color when the congregation sings lustily that God is making us whiter than snow. It isn't just about gender. And being a truly inclusive church can be painful. But frankly, I don't think the pastor should have to bear all the pain. Lay people ought to be insisting that we use inclusive language, insisting that we stop saying everyone stand, but let you rise as you are able. And you should have seen the riot at the church in Dallas when I decided to allow a convicted sex offender to attend church. Now, what would your church have done if he'd wanted to come and worship with you? Would all still mean all? Now, I should say this person had not been guilty of any sexual offense with children. And I should say it was in Texas, where then and now there are thousands of people on the roll of convicted sex offenders who did nothing more than what heterosexual people do all the time, which is meet someone in a park, but became entrapped by police officers who apparently didn't have anything better to do with their time. And this is not just ancient history. I remember very clearly when I was in Dallas having to come to San Antonio because the San Antonio police had entrapped dozens of men in Travis Park. And the next day, the San Antonio newspaper published their names, and one of the men jumped off a bridge and killed himself, and no one would do his funeral. He lost his job, his family, and his life before he ever got his day in court. What would have happened if he'd been a member of your church? Would he have known that he was still welcomed and included and beloved? And it was the board of directors of the largest LGBTQ church in the world who called me on the carpet one day because I did a blessing for a relationship that some did not approve of. You see, 3 men came to me and asked me to marry all 3 of them. Now, it wasn't a legal wedding, of course, but if there had only been 2 men, it still wouldn't have been a legal wedding back then. There are lots of unconventional relationships in this world, more than you have any idea of. Would you? Will you bless them? Or will you force them to sit in the back of the bus in seats still warm from the bodies of LGBTQ people who for centuries were not able to legally marry? My church board questioned the sanctity of their relationship, but mostly they feared what other people, other churches might say about us if we blessed this relationship. Well, as I said at the outset, I am an activist, so clearly I don't much care what people think about me. So I did it. And they came to church every Sunday, and they waited in line to come to me for communion because they knew that I loved them and accepted them and meant all. And long after I was gone from Dallas, just a few years ago now, the oldest member of that throuple died. And he left to the Dallas church over $1 million. And if you go to the Cathedral of Hope today, you'll see this beautiful entrance. He paid for that. He paid for it because I was willing to accept and bless him and his loves. So will your church be able to include folks who practice non-ethical or ethical non-monogamy? Because I don't know if you know this, but lots of gay men have different sexual values than the majority. Can you welcome them, or will you force them to stay in their closets? Many years ago, I was fighting the Texas constitutional amendment that tried to ban same-gender marriage. I spent a lot of time in Austin. Fortunately, had some friends there. We had a forum about this one Sunday night at the Cathedral of Hope, and we invited all of our elected state officials, and I have to say that State Senator Royce West was brave enough to attend. Now, I love Royce, but at one point in his remarks, he said, I just don't know if I approve of same-gender marriage. And I couldn't help myself. I just couldn't stop myself. I stood up and said, Senator West, there's not a person in this room that cares whether you approve of us or not. That is not why we elected you. We elected you to ensure that every citizen of Texas gets equal treatment and the same rights as every other. So give us our rights or give us our taxes back. Well, he was a person of integrity. And he said, you're right, my personal views shouldn't have any impact on how the government of Texas functions. And finally, I want to say that inclusion is not assimilation. I'm sorry that Mark is not in the room because this is my tribute to Star Trek. Last evening, Reverend Ortiz said that we needed to get out of our comfort zones. And I should say that it is ironic to me that little old ladies are not the only ones who have a challenge getting out of their comfort zones. I recently, this new church I'm at, I tried to update their logo. And of course, we want to be an inclusive and diverse church, so I suggested something that had a rainbow comma. A comma, ironically, is the logo of the United Church of Christ, mostly, unlike the cross and the flame. And so I suggested a rainbow comma. The people who opposed it in my current church, a lesbian couple and a gay male couple, they didn't want to go to a gay church. Like, what about this logo says we're going to be a gay church? But that was who opposed it because it was outside of their comfort zone. About 18 months ago, I became the pastor of the Congregational Church, the Arlington Congregational Church in Jacksonville. I moved there primarily because, or partly because, my 90-year-old parents lived just north of there, and I needed to help care for them. It's a wonderful church. It chose to be diverse and vital long before I got there. But it's a mostly, like most mainline churches today, it's a mostly elderly congregation, mostly heterosexual, mostly white. But you got to give it to them. Unlike the Methodist Church, the United Church of Christ doesn't get their pastors by having them appointed by the district superintendent and the bishop. We get our pastors by electing them. So this congregation of mostly elderly heterosexual people elected the former pastor of the largest gay and lesbian church in the world. So I think that's pretty brave, or stupid, I'm not sure which. But and they may have thought it was stupid too, because I'd only been there about 6 weeks when I hired a new cantor or song leader. Her name is Hecate. And Hecate is transgender. Now, Hecate has said, she has passing privilege. What she means by that is she is a transgender person, but most people can't tell. And in that congregation, I guess most people didn't know that she was transgender until last Pride Sunday. And on Pride Sunday last year, I played a video clip of a young man who sang with a countertenor voice, very high voice, some song in a worship service. And then I interviewed Hecate, and she revealed that she was that young man. Now, you could have picked most of the congregation's chin up off the floor. It just didn't know. We hadn't kept it a secret, and I assumed that if one or two people knew, everybody knew, but apparently they didn't. Later, after the service, many of the members of the church thanked me for letting them know, and one of the older women of the church said to me, we are more inclusive than I thought. Then she added with a twinkle in her eye, and I can't wait to tell my Baptist friends. Now, Hecate could simply pass as a heterosexual woman. She could have said no when I asked to interview her, and she certainly could have said no when I asked about showing the video clip of her in her former life. But she said yes, because she wanted to make it easier for young transgender boys and girls. The suicide rate among LGBTQ teens is astronomical. 90% of the churches that you passed on the way here this morning contributed to those statistics. Your assignment is to be a redemptive antidote to that pain that leads young people to suicide. Remember when you were a kid, it's hard for some of us to remember that far back, but remember when you were a kid what it felt like to be the last chosen for a team? Gay men can particularly remember this about athletic teams. Remember what it's like to not be invited to prom, or to be invited late, or even to have to worry about whether or not you would be invited to prom. That kind of pain continues to this day. It's what it feels like to not be included. I now live in the northern part of Florida, just south of South Georgia, where I grew up. Perhaps that's why I still love that old book by Arthur Gordon entitled A Touch of Wonder. It's a semi-biographical tale of rearing his children on the marshes of intercoastal South Georgia. Now, it's been 30 years since I've read that book, but one story out of it still sticks with me to this day. It is his description of how one Saturday afternoon, his wife had gone off shopping and left him there with the 3 kids. And it was a Saturday afternoon in the fall. And on Saturday afternoon in the fall, one of the sacraments you must observe is watching the Georgia Bulldogs play. So that was what he wanted to do with his Saturday afternoon. But they were playing Vanderbilt, so, the outcome was pretty foregone. And so he finally let the kids talk him into taking them out. And so they got in a boat and headed out to this small uninhabited island. 2 girls and a little boy. They were off in search of adventure. They landed their boat there and jumped out and ran off, and along with their Shetland sheepdog that ran off in front of them. And it wasn't long before they suddenly heard the dog barking up a storm and they went to investigate what was going on. They found their dog barking at a loon, a big bird that had dived down for a fish and come up under an oil slick. And the bird was covered with oil and couldn't fly, couldn't swim, couldn't get away from the dog. So the kids gathered around and they said, Daddy, we've got to help the bird. And Gordon said, well, what can we do about the bird? And so we've got to help clean off the oil. So they ran back to the boat and they found a couple of towels and some old rags. And they came back and decided they were going to wipe the bird off. Well, in a few minutes, every single one of them had been bitten and scratched repeatedly, and they hadn't made any dent or any progress in getting the oil off. Daddy, we have to take her back to the house and clean her up. And Gordon said, how are we going to put this bird in our little boat with you three and a dog? And they said, Daddy, we can't just leave her here. She might die. And Gordon knew that was true, that night some predator would get her or she would die of starvation. So he took a towel and threw over the head of the bird, and wrestled it into the boat, and then got the kids in and get the dog in, and they all went back to the house. And he's carrying this bird into the bathroom, thanking God that his wife isn't there, because she'd kill him if she'd seen this bird and all the oil everywhere in her clean bathroom. They used all manners of elixirs and wiped the bird down, and continuing to get bitten and scratched and their arms off. But finally, they got enough oil off that Gordon thought, well, the bird is probably going to make it now. So they put the towel back over the head of the bird, put the bird back in the boat, put the kids back in the boat, put the dog back in the boat, and they went back to the island. Took the bird off and out and set it down. It preened its feathers for a few minutes and then swam off to a sandbar where other birds were resting for the night. The two little girls and the dog ran off, and Gordon stood there beside his son, the youngest of the three kids, named Dana. And Dana reached up and put his hand in his father's, and they were silent there for a moment, watching the bird swim to the sandbar. And then Dana said in a very quiet voice, Daddy, she would have died, wouldn't she? And Gordon said, yes, she would have died. And Dana said, and to think, we almost didn't come. I tell you this story because despite the decision of the General Conference, there are still hundreds of thousands, millions of people out there who are coated with the toxicity of hate and homophobia, and some of them will die unless you are willing to pay the price to be the antidote to that. In my high school yearbook, when they asked what you wanted to be, what you wanted to do when you graduated, beside my picture is the entry, I want to go to college and seminary and be a United Methodist minister. It was all I ever wanted to do, to pastor small town Methodist churches, because frankly, that's all there is in South Georgia. It was what I wanted to do with my life. I was licensed to preach in the United Methodist Church in June of 1973, a month before my 19th birthday. Bishop Cannon sent me off to pastor a small circuit of Methodist churches, saying, even he can't kill them. And I didn't. They grew, and I loved every moment of it. My last year at Emory, I had to admit to myself that my days as a United Methodist were numbered. When United Methodist Church forced me to choose between my love for my church and my love for Bill, I chose Bill. I still talk to him every day. Together, we did a pretty good job in terms of ministry, and I'm willing to admit that since his death, I am a pale shadow of the person and the pastor I used to be. One Easter, when I was at the Cathedral of Hope, we had to rent the Morton Meyerson Symphony Center downtown, because despite the fact that our sanctuary seated 1,000 people, it still wasn't nearly big enough. And in fact, the Meyerson Center, which seats 2,200, wasn't big enough either. We had to have 2 services there. So on that Easter Sunday, Kristen Chenoweth sang, "Was it a morning like this?" And I stood up and looked out over those 4,000 people, and I looked up in the balcony, and I spotted Bill sitting in Ross Perot's box next to my mother and father, who were good Methodists, and his mother, who was a Southern Baptist deacon. I looked at them, and before I preached that morning, I said in my head to the United Methodist Church what Joseph said to his brothers who had sold him into slavery: "You may have meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." I know that this is true, that God means good for us all. Being a truly inclusive church is harder than it sounds. I wonder sometimes if it isn't also hard for God. I know this because the other day I was struggling, and I felt the hand of God reach down and touch me. And I noticed that hand was covered with bites and scratches, and some of them were mine. Thank you for letting me be with you today. Amen. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, and thank you for being here. Do we have time for questions, or? Oh, that's up to. Okay. All right. So I'll stay here, and any of you who have questions can stick around too.
So, once again, can you show your appreciation?
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you for sharing your story with us and for being vulnerable, and it's very inspirational. Thank you. We're going to move into, we have a couple of breakout sessions. Reverend Piazza will be right here in the sanctuary, and so your questions, your conversation, we can just carry on with that. We'll take a short break first. And then Dr. Aaron Beasley will be in the Labyrinth Room, and we'll continue that conversation. And I wish I could split myself in two so I could be in both places. I guess I'll just run back and forth. But take a short break now. Come back in 5 minutes, and